I'm thrilled to be here and honored, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Metcalf Institute. I'd also like to thank Catherine, Karen, Devante, and Jack for helping out with the logistics today. And as Sunshine mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about what could potentially happen to the ocean if we try to mitigate. And this is based on some recent work that we did, which was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research Letters. And I'd like to just acknowledge my two co-authors on that study, John Dunne and Charlie Stock from GFDL. So before I launch into what our model results showed, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on climate and modeling, and also on what long-term climate changes mean and how we assess those, and also talk a little bit about the importance of ocean and marine ecosystems. Then I'll talk about the ocean responses to mitigation, and finally I'll just conclude with some future directions that we're looking at. So, the Earth's climate is changing rapidly, and we want to understand, we try to understand the interactions and feedbacks in the Earth by studying the Earth as an entire system. We look at the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, and the ice, and also the Earth's biogeochemical cycles to get process understanding, understanding how things work, and then from that we can use that information to try to better predict how the climate will change in the future. So this slide is just showing a depiction of the carbon cycle. CO2 is moving around in the atmosphere. It gets, wrong one. And it gets taken up on the land by plants and also in the ocean by the phytoplankton. And then it's released through soil, when soil organic matter decays, and it's also released through respiration. In this way, we also get released through the burning of fossil fuels. So this is a very complex system, and we need to understand how things work. I'm a climate modeler, as Sunshine Mendel mentioned. So to study climate, we use models, computer models to be specific. And we work at climate and Earth system models. And these are just, these models are designed to create a virtual representation of the Earth by representing these processes of the Earth system. So basically what we do is we take the, sorry again. Sorry, I don't like clickers. I always get the wrong one, sorry. So we take the Earth and we break it down into boxes, little grid boxes, and each grid box is three-dimensional. So there's a horizontal grid, the latitude and longitude, and then there's a vertical grid. In the atmosphere, that could be pressure or height, and in the ocean, we have depth or density. And in each box, we model these processes, the biological processes, the climate processes, physical processes, chemical processes. So we take our knowledge and understanding of these processes, and we write computer code, lots and lots of computer code. And from this code, we also design experiments to run with these codes, and then we run them on these giant supercomputers. And we get a ton of output from these models, and we analyze these models. And the results from these model results can feed into assessments, such as the IPCC, and they can also feed back into our own knowledge and understanding so that we can keep doing this loop again of what we call a model development cycle. Our analysis will give us more understanding. We can improve our models and then run experiments again. So this is a loop that we do routinely, and it's important for us to understand, what kind of processes should we be modeling when we model climate. So what affects the climate? So the different mechanisms, the energy output from the sun. The sun has an 11-year cycle, and the radiation reaching the top of the atmosphere can affect climate. Similarly, volcanic eruptions can output dust and particulates, which can block sunlight from coming into the Earth. We also have greenhouse gases, which you all have heard a lot about. These are things like carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and ozone, and they trap the heat in the atmosphere, so they can change the climate as well. And then additionally, we have aerosols, which can cool the climate. So what I'm showing, so how do these forcings affect the Earth? And in particular, I'm going to show you what happens to the ocean temperature. And this graph here is just showing a plot of temperature on the vertical axis plotted against time from 1860 to 2000. And there are lots of lines here, and I'll walk you through some of these. These are model results of global mean ocean temperature, the top 3,000 meters, as simulated by one of our models. So the yellow line here is what is a control run. So there's no forcing here. It's just fixed at 286, and the model runs for a very long time, so the model is very stable. And what we do here is we have every single, we perform what we call single forcing experiments. What I mean by that is we take each forcing and run them individually through our model and see what the result is. So if I look at the orange line here, this is the result when we run with only the greenhouse gases activated. And you can see we get warming when we have greenhouse gases. There are two things about the lines in green. At the bottom here, those little triangles, those are volcanic eruptions. So this one here is Krakatoa. The one here at the end is Pinatubo. And what you see happening at volcanic events is cooling. The temperature drops here, temperature drops here. So we know that the volcanoes will cool the planet. The green line is showing the net, you see that there's net cooling when you have what we call natural forcing. By natural forcing, I mean volcanic plus solar. So it's the solar cycle and all the volcanoes, and those tend to cool the atmosphere, and it offsets a lot of the warming from all the anthropogenic emissions in red here. Finally, the blue line is the response for aerosols only. And you can see here, this blue line cools the planet, and it offsets about half of the global ocean warming from the greenhouse gases. So this much here is about this much here, and then there's a bit of an offset here, right? And the black line is if we were to add all these forcings, which is what we have in the world, and the Earth is what the response that we get, from putting in all forcings together. And the red dots and the blue dots are just observations, so you can see our models tend to reproduce the ocean temperatures pretty well. So it's very important for us as we do model development and running the models and producing output that we are able to validate our models. We do that by assessing our model results, by comparing our output, the simulations to present-day climate, simulations of present-day climate to observations that we collect from space, from the oceans, and from the land. So in space, we have satellites. These can give us a lot of global coverage of the planet. We can also have balloons. We also have things like aircraft measurements. On the ocean, we have the ships that go out to sea. We also have things like plankton recorders and Argo arrays where we collect information which we use to validate our models. The top example here on the right is an example of something called a tall tower. These are towers that we have on land, and we measure things like CO2 from these towers. So this is a particular example using CO2. What I'm showing here on the top left is a map of all the CO2 observing stations that we have. This is a cooperative global effort to monitor trace gases, CO2 being one of them. So you can see we have observation stations on land. We have on the ocean, these are like ship tracks. You can also see lots of gaps in where we have coverage. So there's spatial gaps in the coverage. Some of these stations have continuous measurements, but some don't. So there's also gaps in time of how we get the data. But despite this, we can use this data to help constrain our models and to try to, it tells us where our models should lie, and use that to try to understand the processes controlling the abundances or how much of these trace gases we have. On the bottom left, I have an example of showing the CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa. Mauna Loa is in Hawaii, and it's the longest continuous record that we have of CO2, starting from 1958, from when the CO2 concentration was about 311, and we're now in 2016, and it's gone past 400 parts per million. And on the right hand here, this figure is sometimes called a flying comet. And what I'm showing here is a plot of CO2 versus latitude and time. So basically, it's the information here interpolated onto a graph so you can get this nice figure. And you can see an increasing trend in CO2 over time. You can also see that the northern hemisphere is much higher, has much higher CO2 than the southern hemisphere because of all the land and the vegetation in the northern hemisphere. And you can also see this cyclical seasonal pattern hidden, that's in the CO2 record. So these are nice ways to get data and to have these to validate our models. We also want to try to build confidence in our models. So we have confidence that our models are doing well because our models are built on fundamental laws, established physical laws, and also on our observations and current understanding. The models also show considerable skill in representing things like mean climate, whether it's sea surface temperature or precipitation, and also in simulating climate variability, that's things like ENSO. And we can also use models to reproduce features of past climates and climate change. So this figure here is taken from the IPCC fourth assessment. On the left, vertical axis is just temperature change, and the horizontal axis is time starting from 1900 to early 2000. And what you're seeing here in black is observations of surface air temperature. The yellow lines are model simulations, the output from model simulations. 14 climate models were run, 58 different simulations, and this is just the spread of this model simulation, with the red being the model mean. And you can see the models do a good job of capturing this observed global mean near surface temperature anomaly. They can reproduce this trend, the upward trend in temperature, and it's capturing the variability pretty well also. So what are the effects of climate change? And we've all heard about impacts, and the important thing I want to bring across to you is that the climate change impacts will occur across all the Earth system components. So from the IPCC assessments, this is language that how they describe things of very likely or increased risk. So I'm going to repeat some of that here. We know that surface temperature has increased, and that the global temperature change is very likely due to human activity. We also know that sea ice and glaciers are melting. Here's an example of Arctic sea ice. What I'm looking at is the ice coverage in 1984, which is a typical year, compared to the ice coverage in 2012. And you see this huge reduction in sea ice coverage in the Arctic. We also know that sea level is rising. This graph on the right-hand side is a plot of the sea level change on the vertical axis, plotted against time, starting from 1860. In the gray, we have estimates because we don't have observational instruments prior to that. So these are just estimates in the gray. From about 1870 to 2000, the red line shows data that we've collected from tide gauges. And the green line here, which is probably a little hard to see, that's from satellite data. So you can see the sea level rising here. And the blue cone at the end is model projections or model simulations of how sea level might be expected to change depending on scenarios. Some other effects of climate change include increasing it's expected that hurricane intensity is likely to increase. And on the bottom left here, what I've shown is the projected changes in Atlantic hurricane frequency over the 21st century. And in the red is the category 4 and 5 hurricanes, and you can see that there's a projected to increase. We also expect increased risk of flooding in low-lying areas, as seen in this panel on the right-hand side. My talk today is mostly about ocean, but I thought I'd mention that the land is also expected to see the effects of climate change, such as a likely increase in areas affected by drought and also increasing risk of wildfires as the planet warms. So on the ocean side, one of the big effects is ocean acidification. And what I mean by that is the ocean has a pH of around 8 or so, and as CO2 enters into seawater, it mixes and becomes an acid called carbonic acid, and that makes the ocean less alkaline or more acid. And what I'm showing here is what we is a healthy reef system, but as the ocean is acidified, or you have ocean acidification, you end up with corals being bleached, and your healthy reef system now looks like this. And on the right-hand side, I wanted to show some model projections of this. So the top panel, so both panels show aragonite saturation state. What that means is the potential for of organisms to calcify or to make shells. So an aragonite saturation state of something bigger than 1 means it's hard to dissolve, and if it's less than 1, it's easier to dissolve. So in the top panel, which is for 2010, you see most of the ocean is still doing pretty well, especially in the tropics where the coral reefs are. But by 2100, most of the ocean is like 1 or less. So you can see there's a potential for a lot of coral bleaching by 2100 if we were to continue on a high emission trajectory, which is what these results are from. So going back to the Earth System Model, I talked about climate models and Earth System models, and both of them have similar components. You have an atmosphere, which has circulation, it has radiation, it has clouds and aerosols, and you also have ocean physics, which is coupled to ocean ecology, ocean physics and land physics. And that's just a climate model. When we talk about an Earth System model, it means we want to add all the biogeochemical interactions on top of that. So we can have things like atmospheric chemistry, interactive CO2, and then we add comprehensive ocean ecology and biogeochemistry, and terrestrial ecosystems and land use. And we can make CO2 interactive, and that's what we do in our Earth System models at GFDL. By making CO2 interactive, you allow a two-way interaction between the atmosphere and the land, and the atmosphere and the ocean. And so this coupling of the climate and the carbon cycle can allow you to investigate feedbacks in the system. Some of the questions we try to answer when we do Earth System model with carbon climate models is how much CO2 will the land and the ocean continue to take up? What are the biogeochemical feedbacks? And what are the biogeochemical and ecological impacts? Another question we can ask and try to understand is what happens with what is long-term climate changes? How do we assess those, and what kind of responses can we expect when over centuries to a millennium? So to assess these long-term climate changes, we use scenarios. They're called representative concentration pathways. And these are just projections of how, for instance, greenhouse gases will change over the next century from 2100 to 2300 and beyond. We can also use what are idealized scenarios or simple scenarios to try to assess climate change on these very long time scales of century to millennia. The reason we try to do this is because of climate change commitment. Climate change commitment just means that the effects of our past human activities will continue to be felt in the future, even if we try to stop emissions. So we can try to investigate this commitment using idealized mitigation scenarios. Some of these are listed here. There's a constant composition or an immediate stabilization of radiative forcing. What I mean by that is I have greenhouse gases at some level, and I freeze them at a certain time, and they don't change after that. So the composition of the Earth's atmosphere is going to stay the same, and then we can look at how the climate evolves. There's also zero emission scenarios. And in this particular case, what you do is you stop all emissions, and again, see how the climate is going to evolve. You can also do constant emissions, where you, again, sort of similar to the constant composition, you keep emissions level constant. There have been experiments where you artificially restore carbon dioxide to pre-industrial levels. And this is all idealized, so, and it's a model, so you can do that. There's no way we can probably do this in the real world, but it's a way to try to understand what could happen. And then there's the concept of reversibility. And reversibility is just, can you get back to where you started from? How long is it going to take? Are there things that are reversible, and are there things that are not reversible? And if something is reversible, how long is it going to take to get back to that position, to where you started from? So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of these scenarios so you get an idea of what we try to do. There's a lot of information here, but I mostly want to focus on the orange line. Okay, so this is an example of a constant composition scenario. On the top graph is a is the CO2 plotted against time from 1900 to 2200. And what we have is CO2 increasing up to 2000, and then we hold the composition constant from 2000 to 2100. The bottom graph is the response of the temperature to this scenario. And again, just focus on the orange line, and you can see from 1900 to 2000, you had about a 0.6 degree change of warming happening. But then you also have this, even though you've held the composition of the atmosphere constant here at 2000 levels, the Earth is still continuing to warm. And that's what we mean by the commitment, the climate commitment. Okay, so there's already warming in the pipeline that has to come out. And it's estimated at about 0.6 degrees, an additional 0.6 degrees centigrade of warming by 2100. And the reason we have this additional warming is because of what's called the thermal inertia of the ocean. And that just means that the ocean has a very large heat capacity, and it can take up a lot of heat, but it also needs time to get all that heat out of the ocean. And so this thermal inertia of the ocean is contributing to this additional warming that we are seeing. This is an example of a zero emission scenario. And in the top graph, again, this is CO2 plotted against time. And now we have CO2 emissions rising, and then we stop them abruptly, and then we see what happens. And this was done for various types of, for various levels of emissions. Here, that's what these different lines are. So what you see here is that the CO2 falls off to about 40% of the peak above the pre-industrial value, which is about 286. And that happens within a few centuries, and it happens with all the scenarios. And when you look at the temperature, that's the bottom panel, or the surface warming that happens as a result of these different scenarios, you see that the temperature also levels off after several centuries. But there have been studies that show you actually need probably millions of years to get full recovery or to go back to pre-industrial levels. And again, that's due to, there's a very long residence time of atmospheric CO2. So the CO2 in the atmosphere stays there for a long time. And there's also deep ocean processes where it takes a long time for the ocean to overturn and bring the heat back up or the carbon back up. And this is what is contributing to this sort of very, very long time scale needed for recovery back to pre-industrial levels. The last kind of scenario I'll mention here is what are called reversibility scenarios. So again, these plots here are CO2 plotted against time. Let's focus on the black line. Here the CO2 is rising at a rate of 1% per year, and it gets up to 4x here. And then what you do is you reverse that at the same rate back down. This particular experiment was done at the CO2 went up to 1.5 times its value, and then got reversed twice, and then 3 times, and then 4 times. And what in the bottom panel, what you're seeing is the temperature response to these experiments. So as the CO2 is rising here, the temperature is increasing, and when the CO2 starts to decrease, the temperature decreases as well, but you see it doesn't fall back at the same rate. That's the sort of dotted line here. So we have what's called a hysteresis response, or a lag response in the global mean temperature as a result. And again, this is due to the inertia of the ocean, the thermal inertia of the ocean. And this is true not only for temperature, but it's also true for things like ocean heat content and precipitation. These type of experiments have also been done with and looked at sea level. And in the case of sea level, I haven't presented it here, but sea level, global average sea level, has a very, very long time scale for reversibility. It takes on the order of centuries for the sea level, for just a small change in sea level to come back down. So now I want to shift gears a little bit, since I'm going to be talking to you about the ocean responses to mitigation, and just recap why are oceans and marine ecosystems important. So the oceans regulate the Earth's climate because they take up a lot of heat and they store heat and carbon in the system. The phytoplankton in the ocean are the basis of the marine food web, and they provide the oceans and the marine ecosystems provide services of very high socioeconomic value, for instance, all the fisheries of the world. The reason we're concerned is because climate change is projected to affect ocean circulation and the amount of nutrients in the ocean, as well as and also projected to reduce the diversity of oceanic species, for instance. Now, any such changes in the composition or the makeup of the ocean, or in the redistribution of the net primary production of the ocean under climate change or under mitigation, can affect how much carbon can affect the carbon uptake in the ocean, and it can also affect things like fisheries, because if suddenly where you're fishing, if the phytoplankton have moved from where you were fishing, then your fisheries might have to shut down or get relocated. Another thing that's important is that we could have potential what I call regime shifts in the marine ecosystem, since if the makeup of the ocean has changed from one type of primary producer to a different type, that could have important consequences for things like fisheries as well. And so it's very important for us to understand, to assess not only the impact of rising greenhouse gases, but also how permanent this impact are. So we measure, what is net primary production, and how can we infer it? So this is a figure from NASA. It's showing ocean chlorophyll. And ocean chlorophyll is used to infer how much phytoplankton you have in the ocean, and therefore what is the net primary productivity of the ocean. And so what I want you to remember here is in the dark blue areas, this is where we have warm water here, and it's also very low in nutrients, and there's little life that exists in these areas here, which are the subtropical gyres of the ocean. And these are usually called the ocean deserts. The green and the red areas are where we have cooler waters and more nutrients, and so you have higher productivity in these areas. The highest productivity is usually around coastal regions and river mouths, because we have lots of nutrients in these regions, and you also have upwelling, which brings up these cool, nutrient-rich waters in these areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about net primary production and how that's going to respond to climate change. So the top figure here is an example of what happens in the tropics. So remember from the previous graph that, maybe I'll just go back to it here. In the tropics here, we have high productivity, but we also have warm water. So when the water is warm, it's lighter and it floats on top of the deeper, colder water. So that limits the amount of mixing you can have, and it prevents nutrients from coming up to the top. So you have some productivity. Now, as the temperature warms, as climate warms, your temperature is going to be, it's going to get even warmer, and so that's going to make the ocean stratification increase. So the water is going to be more stable, and there's going to be less mixing than before, and that's going to prevent nutrients from coming up even more. So in that case, you would expect in the tropical regions to have a decrease in the net primary productivity. In contrast with in the higher latitudes like the Arctic, here where you see a lot of primary productivity, those regions tend to experience very intense vertical mixing, which can bring all the phytoplankton down to depth. But when they go to depth, there's no light available for them to photosynthesize. And so in those regions, you have what's called light limitation. Now, as the climate warms, you'll also get reduced mixing, but you also get freshening, because we expect to have increased precipitation, and we'll also have sea ice melting. And as sea ice melts, you have more regions that are ice-free, and so you can have the phytoplankton start photosynthesizing, and then in those areas, you might expect to see an increase in the net primary productivity. So now I'm going to, now that you have this background, hopefully, we can talk some more about some of the results from our study. This picture here is just showing projected ocean responses to climate change, some of which we've talked about before. The top figure is the temperature changes that you expect from the historical, and then also what are the RCPs. So these are an ensemble of models in CMIP5. So these, again, are very many models. And they're showing that as we have climate warming, there's increasing sea surface temperature, but there's a large spread. These bars here show how much of a spread the models have in the sea surface temperature. Similarly, we look at the net primary production in these models, and we see overall there's a decrease in the marine net primary production. Again, nutrients are decreasing, and again, with a very large spread. Another result that's important for the ocean is that we expect increased stratification over much of the ocean. That's all the orange and the red, which means as the ocean warms and the sea surface temperature rises, you have more stratification occurring. And this is important, like I just mentioned, because of the it limits how much nutrients you can get from below. So we've seen, I talked a little bit about the reversibility of the Earth system and the lag that we saw in the sea surface temperature due to the thermal inertia of the ocean. We discussed that before, but I wanted to go over it a little bit more because this graph is a little bit different to what you saw before. Again, here I have temperature on the vertical axis, but now I'm plotting it against the CO2 concentration. So it's no longer time on the horizontal axis. So as the red line shows the increasing CO2 over time, and then we are going to reverse the CO2, sort of like the reversibility experiments, and decreasing CO2 over time here. And you see the lag in sea surface temperature. And so the question we wanted to ask was, does NPP follow temperature? And so my experimental design is to take one of the GFDL's model. It's a fully coupled carbon climate concentration driven model, which means we use concentrations of greenhouse gases in the model as opposed to emissions. We have an ocean biogeochemistry model called TOPAZ2, and we have, what we're going to do is take the RCP 8.5, that's the high emission scenario. It starts in 2006 and goes to 2100, and then I'm going to reverse the forcings for the next 100 years. So mirror image the forcings, but preserve the seasonality and also hold land use constant. This is just a little bit on the ocean biogeochemistry model in Earth System Model. It's called TOPAZ2. We have a suite of elemental cycles. We represent carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, alkalinity, silicon, and lithogens. We have implicit grazing. We have flexible, what's called stoichiometry. And we have aragonite and calcite cycling. It's also the only model that we know aware of where we can separate our large phytoplankton into diatoms and non-diatoms. And there's a lot of stuff here, but I just want you to understand that it's a very comprehensive model that we have in our Earth System Model to try to understand ocean biogeochemistry and represent all the processes in ocean biogeochemistry. Just a quick slide to tell you that our model, to validate our model, we are able to reproduce carbon stores and fluxes. So here is observational numbers for how much carbon is in different reservoirs and pools and the fluxes, and this is on the right-hand side is the Earth System Model numbers. And below, I just put a map of the net primary production, so you can see very similar patterns that are similar to the observations. So going a little bit more into the results, we've seen this particular result before. Here's the sea surface temperature, and there's the lag of the sea surface temperature response that you've seen before. And plotted on the right is a spatial map, which is essentially showing the difference between the last 50 years of my experiment compared to the first 50 years of the experiment. So, sorry, I'll just go back quickly here. So it's 50 years here compared to 50 years here. So the end of the ramp down compared to the beginning of the ramp up. Now, if everything were reversible, my graph here on the right would look white because my zero is at the center. And what this is telling you is different regions are going to respond differently under reversibility. And overall, we're seeing a lot of heat being retained by the ocean. That's the yellows and the reds. But in some regions, we actually have cooling, and those regions are the very convective regions of the ocean. So now we can look at the NPP, and the first thing we notice is that this response is different in contrast to the sea surface temperature response. So here in the ramp up, our NPP is more or less stable. That's due to our model. It has very efficient recycling, so it stays fairly stable even though temperature is rising. Then in the ramp down, you can see here that the NPP goes past the value that we started from. So it's exceeding the contemporary values after mitigation. So that's different to what we saw before with the temperature. And so why is that? Because you would sort of expect NPP to follow temperature to first order. If you look at the spatial patterns, what you can see, so we do see increased NPP in the high latitudes, like in the Arctic, like we saw in one of my previous graphs. That's what we expected. But what we didn't expect was to see an enhanced productivity in the subtropics. And we also see declines in where we had these very convective regions. So to understand what's going on here, we have to look at the drivers of NPP. We talked a little bit about nutrients and light and temperature. So this is the mixed layer depth here on the left and the surface nitrate on the right. And overall here, what you see is the maximum mixed layer depth, or where the mixing happens. We see decreases as the temperature warms, but we see, again, this overshoot as similar to the NPP. And again, we can also look at the spatial patterns, and you can see here for the nitrate, and to a little bit here, you can see it in the maximum mixed layer that the subtropics, again, these areas where you have both residual warming and enhanced surface nitrate. And we also have declines in regions where we have cold SSTs and decreases in mixed layer depth. So what's the mechanism for this overshoot of NPP? To understand that, we have to look into the ocean at depth. So plotted here is, again, temperature evolution or temperature change. This is depth here, and this is time. The horizontal line here is, I put it at 1,000 meters, so this is the upper ocean, and this is the lower ocean. And then the vertical line is right at 2100, where we reverse the forcing. If everything were reversible, things on the right would look like things on the left. But as you can see, the pattern is not the same. So what is happening here is you have a lot of warming that's continuing at depth, even though you're cooling in the ramp down. And that's weakening the stratification here, or the vertical density gradients. And this is causing more mixing, and that's what's driving, as you have more mixing, you get more nutrients being brought up, and so you can have more primary production and the NPP overshoot. Finally, I just want to mention a little bit about how the composition of the ocean has changed as well in this particular experiment. I'm looking here at the diatoms, which I separate in the large phytoplankton, which is separated into diatoms and non-diatoms. And what you can see, the large diatoms are more or less reversible, but the large non-diatoms have this very similar pattern to what we saw with the net primary production. And so this enhancement of the net primary production is coming mostly from large non-diatoms. And similarly, the spatial patterns, you can see, again, this enhancement in the subtropics very similar to the NPP, the net primary production. So what's causing this? Again, we have to look at depth. Plotted at the top is the nitrate evolution, or the nitrate in the ocean, and bottom is the silicate. So what we're seeing here is a very strong depletion of silicate. That's all the blue and the purple, compared to the nitrate. So much more silica is being depleted, and it gets shifted to depth. And when you have less silica available, it means the non-diatoms can compete better. And so that's why you have this shift in community composition. Very quickly, I just want to say, moving forward, we are trying to develop higher resolution models where we increase not just the resolution of the model, but the comprehensive. So we have more complex models to try to have different kind of applications. The model I've been talking about is this ESM2M, and that ocean is 1 degree, And these are just some numbers to say that we can get lots of model layers per day, which is a good thing. But we also have higher resolutions, which are a quarter degree. We only get 7.5 model layers per day. And then one model, 1/10 of a degree, it's called ESM2.6. It has a different biogeochemistry model called Cobalt, where we include zooplankton. And we can only get 8 model months per day, and it runs on something like 15,000 processes. So it's a huge model. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but this is an example of net primary productivity in our quarter degree ocean. You see the different faces of the globe. This is net primary production on both land and ocean. And the reason we're interested in having high resolution models is that we can capture coastal ecosystems much better. So this is the 1/10 of a degree model. It's looking at the California current. And this is the satellite observations, and this is our original model. And you can see the ESM2.6 does a much better job at capturing the California current signal. So yeah, she's going to help me just show you a quick graph. So this is a simulation of ocean chlorophyll from the 1/10 of a degree model. Yeah, sorry, it's this one. Thank you. Oh, okay. We don't have to go through the whole thing. So this is ESM2.6, which has the different biogeochemistry model. This is surface chlorophyll. You can see lots of eddies in the ocean. That's what a high resolution will do. You can see chlorophyll booms. You can see the seasonal chlorophyll. And this is just a nice visualization showing you what we can do with these higher resolution models. So I think that's it. Yes. Which one? Ah, thank you. Okay, so in conclusion, we saw that NPP exceeds contemporary values after mitigation, and this was a surprise. We have legacy warming, subsurface warming, which weakened our density gradients and increased mixing and gave us enhanced surface nitrate. We also saw a shift in phytoplankton community structure because of less silica available in the upper ocean. And I would like to point out that it's important to have not just global mean numbers to look at when you look at reversibility, but also to look at spatial maps and maps of ocean depth, because you can see different patterns in there that are very important, because not all responses are the same. You can just have things counterbalancing. And we would like to do further multi-model intercomparison projects on looking at reversibility in different models to see if they give the same response, and also to look at high-resolution models to look at coastal ecosystems and examine reversibility there. So I'd just like to acknowledge a project called Embrace, which had this idea of developing this reversibility scenario, and thank you very much, and I'll take questions.